Welcome, welcome everybody. I will have to look at the camera, but also at the real room. It's one of those experiments where we bridge across the virtual space and the real space. But it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for coming on a Friday afternoon. But we are up for a real treat. I'm Eugenio Refini, a faculty member in the Department of Italian Studies here at New York University. And I'm really delighted about having three great scholars today discussing a very important recent publication. So we will be talking about Corrado Confalonieri's latest monograph on Torquato Tasso. And we have two guests of honors, Professors Daniel Javitch and David Quint, who are leading experts in the field of epic, among many other things. So we are really in very good hands. Corrado is in very good hands today for the discussion of his book. So the format will be that I will briefly introduce our guests, and then Corrado will give a short presentation about the book, and then we will move swiftly onto the discussion with remarks from Daniel and David, and we will move from there. So today, I just wanted to show the physical copy of the book, and I will circulate it here in the room, which we are discussing today, by Corrado Confalonieri, Torquato Tasso e il desiderio di unità, la Gerusalemme liberata e una nuova teoria dell'etica, which came out with Carocci in Rome last year in 2022. So Corrado is currently a junior assistant professor at the University of Parma. He holds not one, but two doctoral degrees, a PhD in Romance languages and literatures from Harvard University, 2019, and a dottorato in Italian literature and history of Italian language from the University of Padua, 2014. He taught at Wesleyan University as a visiting assistant professor of Italian, and he was also the Lauro De Bosis Fellow in Italian Studies at Harvard in 2020-2021. His publications beyond the book, which is circulating in the room, and I invite the guests online to just check it out on the website of Carocci. You will easily find it even via Google, Torquato Tasso e desiderio di unità. So beyond this book, Corrado is also the author of other publications. Another one which I have here is this one here. Queste spaziose logge, architettura e poetica nella tragedia italiana del Cinquecento, which came out with Loffredo in 2022. He also has a number of articles on topics spanning from the Renaissance to the 20th century. He has edited an anthology of Boiardo's works with Joan Cavallo, as well as a multidisciplinary book on teaching, Il mestiere di insegnante. And together with Nicola Catelli is the co-editor-in-chief of Parole Rubate, rivista internazionale di studi sulla citazione, a journal which is quite familiar to many of us. So Corrado is joined today by two of the greatest scholars in the field of Renaissance epic, and I would say, in the field of epic more broadly, Professors Daniel Javitch and David Quint. I will stick to the sort of highlights of their resumes, because of course it would be by far too long to go through all their publications and achievements. So let me begin with Professor Daniel Javitch. We are really happy to have him back at Casa Italiana for this event. Daniel is Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at New York University, and he knows this building very well. So it's really lovely to have him with us today. His publications include some very important books, very important to most of us: Poetry and Courtliness in Renaissance England, and perhaps sort of even closer to the topic of our discussion today, the much celebrated Proclaiming a Classic, the canonization of Orlando Furioso. He also has a collection of essays in Italian, Saggi sull'Ariosto e la composizione dell'Orlando Furioso, which have been developing further his own scholarship on the Orlando Furioso. He has edited the Norton critical edition of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. He's a leading scholar in fields such as European literature of the Renaissance, poetic theory before 1700, post-classical history of the ancient genres. He's also the recipient of numerous awards, including fellowships from Villa Tatti, the ACLS, the American Academy in Rome, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Our other guest discussing Corrado's book today is Professor David Quint. He's a starting professor of English and professor of comparative literature at Yale University, which he joined after teaching at Princeton University. He is also a world-renowned scholar, particularly of European Renaissance literature, epic poetry, literary theory, theory of genres, and the history of the classical tradition. He's the author of numerous publications, and even here I'm just cherry-picking some of the most famous titles, including Epic and Empire, which is very relevant to our discussion today, and certainly a book which kind of brings us into some of the big questions which Corrado is going to talk about, but also Montaigne and the Quality of Mercy, Cervantes' novel of Modern Times, a new reading of Don Quixote, and Inside Paradise Lost. He's also the author of seminal translations of Italian works, such as the Stanze of Angelo Poliziano, a very important translation, and also the translator of the Cinque Canti by Ariosto, which was another milestone in sort of letting the lesser-known Italian works of the Renaissance to come to the Anglo-American audience. So without further ado, I would like to invite Corrado here, and we will begin with his presentation before the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Eugenio, for the presentation, and thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you for having us today at the Casa Italiana. I actually remember watching videos of events that took place here when I was preparing the application for the PhD here in the US, and it's great to be back in a way. And Eugenio has said already many things, but let me say a couple of words about Daniel Javitch and David Quint, and about how important their books you named. Some of them, I want to stress the fact that without proclaiming a classic and without Epic and Empire, it would not be there, of course, many other works that we are familiar with in Renaissance studies, but I think I would not be here in a way, I would not come here. Really, I remember the days in which I read their books in Italy, in Padua, working on this project, which has been a really long project. It took almost 12 years to complete the book, even if it's not that long. But it's a long project, and it's great today to have the opportunity to discuss it together with you. So thank you very much for your participation. And yes, that's me. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, as Eugenio said, we thought that it might be useful to have an introduction to the book for those who haven't read it so far, and it will last about 10-15 minutes, so that we have plenty of time to discuss it together. And it will be a very general introduction, and I will try to keep it as close as possible to the title, not so much of the book, but of this book discussion, Torquato Tasso and the New Theory of Epic. And so Torquato Tasso on one hand, on the other hand, the New Theory of the Epic. Sorry, I will stop here and there to admit. Okay, fatto. So Torquato Tasso and the New Theory of Epic. This title, in a way, mirrors the structure of the book. It's not made explicit, but it's obviously there. There is a part of the book that it covers more or less the first three chapters, which refers to theory and the theory of the epic, and there is a last chapter, so the chapters are four and an introduction, that is a reading of the Giovanni Liberata. So my aim today in this very short introduction is to address the question of why a new theory of the epic, why we need it, and where we can find it in some, or where we should look for it, and why Tasso. So going back to the very beginning of the project, this is a part that in a way, sometimes I struggle to remember, because I said it's a long time ago, but I think it's useful to start here to make it as simple as possible. I remember at the beginning, I had a sort of different questions that I was trying to weave and connect and address together. On the one hand, I remember I wanted to, in a way, and it's important for me to use this word, deconstruct the opposition between epic and novel that you find in a very famous essay by Mikhail Bakhtin. On one hand, there is the theory and the theory component of the project. On the other hand, a reading of the Liberata. And here these are very well-known things, but as many of you that you are here today, and many of those are following online, know the opposition between epic in Italian, epica e romanzo, and I will go back immediately to the fact that romanzo in Italian includes, in a way, both romance and novel. Epica and romanzo, the opposition of epica and romanzo has been very important in the recent history of reading of the Liberata. Okay, so epic and novel on the one hand, Bakhtin on the other hand, reading of the Liberata. I started there in a way, and one of the first steps were, of course, that the project was to historicize the opposition between epic and romanzo that you find in Bakhtin in the Cinquecento, and discuss the poetics of the 16th century poetics, the poetics of Tasso, and go back to a period in which the first time in history that the opposition between epic and romanzo, but in that case refer to the English term epic and romance, was important, was an issue for the literati and for poets. So Bakhtin, 16th century poetics, the reading of the Liberata. I fast forward to the next steps of the project. I thought it could be important to discuss three key moments in the history of the theory of epic, in which the idea of epic was defined by in the context of oppositions to other genres. First of all, that this happens already in Aristotle's Poetics. In that case, the opposition is between epic and tragedy. As you know, in the Poetics, Aristotle deals mostly with tragedy, and at the very end of the book that we have, these notes, this very problematic text to work with, at the very end it gets to the epic and it discusses the epic, but it's clear that the epic, as Daniel Javitch said, among others, is a proto-tragedy. So is sort of the first stage, the first step of the development that then gets to tragedy. So epic and tragedy in Aristotle, and then the reason in the book short part dedicated to Horace, which was very important in the Renaissance in the reading of Aristotle. That was so one of the key issue of the literary theory in the 16th century. And then in 16th century poetics, the opposition is epic and romance. Here, let's summarize very briefly. On the one hand, we have the study of the poetics, Aristotle commentaries, and other translations, another discussion that was important in the literary theory of the time, and on the other hand, the reception of the Orlando Furioso. I started to work in a period more or less at the end of the 16th century in order to reconstruct the context in which the Gerusalemme Libera was made possible. And then the third moment of the history of the theory of the epic I worked on is the, in chronological order, I should say, Hegel, Lukács, Bakhtin, and those who more recently started from there to theorize the romanzo, so the novel in this case. I say in chronological order, Hegel comes first, but in the book, and this is Hegel comes first, chronologically speaking, but I keep him at the end of the chapter because I think that there is a sort of turning point. So the opposition between epic and novel, which has been very important for us and is still very important for us today. So in the introduction of the book, I used this essay by Carlo Ginzburg that came out as I was working on the project in the final period of the work. I read it, this essay, Le nostre parole e le loro parole, so our words and theirs, meaning the words that we use when we discuss, in this case, poems of the Renaissance, and the words that poets and scholars used back then. This is an essay that was very important for me to organize my thought and organize the chapters in which it's, on the one hand, it's clear that epic is a word and is a concept that has always been there, but it took up meanings in time that kept changing in a way. And the key issue for me, from the point of view of theory, is that epic seems to be relatively stable, relatively clear what epic means, because the genre that really needed sort of theory was the other one in the opposition. So in Aristotle, the tragedy; in the 16th century, romance; and later on the romance, the novel. It's important in a way to go back to the discussion of what epic means now, meant at the time. And I was saying that Hegel for me was important because I think that the key term to define epic in the history of theory has been the term of unity, and in particular unity of action. I think here is where we find something that is not theorized in a satisfactory way. I mean, here is the point in which you feel, if you use the concept of epic to read the text of the epic canon, things will not work. Anyway, we need a more complex concept of unity that I try to show, and that it's possible to find in a more complex reading of Hegel. By more complex reading, I mean that it's important to read not only the aesthetics, the work that have been usually discussed and used in the literary theory, but other texts in which Hegel talks about and discusses the action. So broadly speaking, Hegel's theory of action is important to define the epic in a new way and to read in a more correct, I would say, way the poems of the epic canon. So Hegel comes at the end of the part dedicated to theory, and in a way, I try to find the theoretical tools in Hegel to read Tasso anew, and to read Tasso in I would say just a couple of words about the reading of the Giuseppe Liberata, because I think we will talk about it in our conversation. What I try to do is to rethink what has been called with term that comes from the Freudian theory of Freudian literary theory, the formazione di compromesso, so compromise formation between epic and romanzo. The Giuseppe Liberata is a beautiful poem because it's ambiguous. There are contrasts and oppositions and tensions that are not solved. And according to some of the readings, some of the most successful readings of the Giuseppe Liberata, this opposition, this tension, this equilibrio tensivo, this difficult balance is the result of an opposition between epica and romanzo. I try to, in the book, I try to read the epic component of the Liberata as the one that is really responsible for the ambiguity of the text, through reading that, talking about the theory, comes from the sort of reinterpretation of the theory of action in epic and the unity of action in epic that comes from again, and it's useful to read the Liberata and some of the episodes and some of what in the Liberata comes not from the romanzo but from the epic canon, so the Iliad and the Aeneid, and this is where my reading of the epic in a way starts from the readings such as the pessimistic reading of the Aeneid or problematic reading of the Iliad, and so on. I would just a minute to conclude. The book does not, I said at the beginning, why a new theory of the epic? Why do we need it? Where we can find it? So where we can find it, I try to find in Hegel the tools to read the epic in a new way, but I think that the theory of the epic is yet to come, and it should come not from the oppositions to other genres, for example, tragedy, romance, and novel, but from the reading of the texts. Reading of the text that in many cases are already there, Aeneid, the Iliad, and other, but we still should work on the text more than the opposition between epic and other genre. And this is one of the 2 points I want to mention at the end. And the other one is the fact that the book, the last chapter of the book is a chapter on Tasso. There is no epilogue. There is no theory of the epic. I try to, in a way, in the book that the Torquato Tasso, desiderio di unità, the theory of the epic, the new theory of the epic, should emerge from the reading of the Liberata. And I don't know. In the future, we were talking earlier about this. In the future, I would like to try to come up with a sort of theory of the epic, but here the new theory comes from the reading of the Liberata. And I stop here for the moment. And
well, it's a great pleasure to return to the Casa and also to be here for this occasion because I'm an admirer of Corrado's work So it's nice to have the opportunity to show my admiration. The first thing I want to say, which is not really a criticism, but it's really, well, an observation. Corrado, he hasn't mentioned this, he has an enormous bibliography in this book. I can't remember the number of pages, but it must run about 40 pages, this bibliography.
Maybe even more.
Yeah. And he's being very scrupulous because he's obviously referring to the works that he cites, the studies that he cites. And when you read the book, you'll see that these citations are frequent, sometimes in footnotes that are some length. And what I think is a somewhat of a problem here is because these citations are so frequent, it obscures, in my opinion, the originality of the book. He doesn't really take proper credit for the novelty of his study. And it's funny that for some reason I had suppressed the word nuova in the title. But in my opinion, aside from the nuova teoria that you're talking about, I happen to be very impressed with what I would call the analysis of the new theory of the epic in the Cinquecento, because what has to be understood, and I tend to emphasize this perhaps a bit too much, this body of theoretical work is unprecedented, and people can try as much as they want to challenge it, but they won't succeed. It really is, from say the mid-century on, a very special Italian phenomenon. And I would stress Italian because, having been at one time professor of English literature, I can assure you that there's nothing like it in English literature in the 16th century. The 16th century in England is void of theory, I would say. And so I sometimes imagine what professors of English would do if they had this body of theory to work with in terms of the text they look at. We'd have innumerable books about this. There aren't very many books, even in Italian, about it. And that's why I sort of find Corrado's contribution to be very special. I had a note here that repeats what Corrado says, which is that the subject of the book really is unity. Among other things, what produces unity in epic. And since, according to Aristotle, tragedy is an imitation of a complete and entire action, and since tragedy is an imitation not of men, he says, but of actions, a good deal of Corrado's book is on unity of action. And he looks at the way, and here I'm going to sort of, I should make myself clear. I'm not going to discuss very much the Tasso and Liberata part of the book, because I'll leave this to my colleague David. But I'd like to just spend a little time on these writers who are, of course, much less well known. Pina, Minturno, Tasso among them, the Tassisti who were defending the Gerusalemme Liberata after it appeared. And what Corrado does, which really surprised and impressed me, is to find that unity of action is a recurring interest for these people. This is something I must say I sort of missed. But reading the book, I was really quite surprised to see that there was so much discussion of unity of action, and you have to sort of see his subtle analysis in terms of differentiating some of these treatments of unity of action, which are themselves very interesting. And in doing that, what he does, and this again has to be recognized, what he does in this continuing discussion of unity of action is he provides a body of theoretical commentary that has itself not been fully acknowledged. And this is one of the new contributions of the book. I mean, you can go and read a book that we have been indebted to for many years, which is Weinberg's massive history of the Italian criticism of the Renaissance. And I think you have to look pretty hard to realize that unity of action is something that concerns a number of these people. So that part is itself very interesting. Now, what I was going to ask, he also, I should say, as he pointed out, he starts off with a very, not exactly starts off because he has an introduction first, but he starts off when he gets into the text proper, he starts off with an analysis of Aristotle, which itself is interesting because it helps us see things that are not easy to see, because he connects parts of the Poetics to show again how central unity of action is to Aristotle. Sometimes it's, for readers like myself, it's a bit implicit. And so his recognition of that is important. Now, what I was going to ask him, because I don't want to talk too much, is that having read, and I'm going to let him explain this to us, having read his analysis of the Poetics, and then having read his analysis of these several, we'll call them theorists. I like to think of them as thinkers about genre rather than theorists, thinkers about genre. My first question, as you can imagine, Corrado, is how can I put this? How essential do you think, and how influential do you think the Poetics may be for these people? You know that this is, in a way, a tricky question.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the observations and now for the questions. So, how essential is the Poetic? I'm sorry to do that, but I have to. And I will start from an essay of yours that came to my mind when you were. As you were speaking at the beginning of there was a passage of what you said that made me think of your essay, which is in Italian. I quote the title in Italian. I think it came out in English too, but it's Dietro la maschera dell'Aristotelismo, meaning that many of the ideas of in 16th century Poetics are formulated. So you find or the other way around, it's very hard to find someone who says Aristotle was wrong. Okay, I think Castelvetto maybe sometimes, and a few others, because many of the ideas that are clearly not that clearly did not come from Aristotle are presented to other poets, to other literati, and to us now as readers as Aristotelian theories in some ways. And so, for example, when you mentioned Pina, Giraldi and Pina, so unity, what is interesting, tricky, difficult, and all these things together is that unity, everybody talked about unity. Unity is always there. But then if you read it more thoroughly, for example, you discover that unity of action raises the problem of what an action is, for example. And so you have to define an action and say an action, just in Italian, I think it's Pina, but then Tasso again. So many of the ideas are, you find sometimes the same idea in different poets that try to use that idea for different
ends. Mm-hmm.
Okay, for example, ci sono tanti fini quante azioni quanti fini. So there is in order to define an action, it's important to understand what is the end of the action, and once that you are able to discern the end, you can say, or here there is an action. But this is a tool that sometimes the poets and literati and theorists and thinkers of genre, because they were many things together, in some cases. So it's yes, for example, the coincidence between the number of ends and the number of action becomes a tool of reading poems, and even I say in the text impose an ideology on them, because on the text, because once that you have just one end in the action, for example, there is no room left for other ends. So the action becomes much less ambiguous that any of our, I would say, action. Here comes the philosophy and the theory of action are. Mm-hmm. So in a way, Aristotle is important because in the 16th century, many of the ideas are, the vocabulary of speaking with structuralism, the grammar is Aristotelian, but the ideas were not in many cases.
That's good.
So that's where the mascara, the mask of the Aristotelianism comes in, because they were trying to convey new ideas with a language that still it looks Aristotelian to us, and we have to read against the grain. And so for me, Aristotle is important, not as, and this is why I started with your essay, Dietro la maschera dell'Aristotelismo, and there is another one that it's very important for me, on la nascita dei generi letterari nel Cinquecento, because it's we can talk about the generi letterari, literary genre in Aristotle, but the idea of literary genre in the 16th century does not coincide with it's news. In a way, Aristotle provide the vocabulary, the topic, unity, some of the words, some of the concepts are there, but the concepts have still to be defined.
Yes.
So this is
that's very useful.
And
that's very useful. And you're quite right. And as I think about this, I would agree. And it actually is more subtle than when you made an allusion to being against Aristotle. I sort of thought, he's going to blame me for this. I have an essay, and it's not an essay, it's actually a lecture, the title of which entertains me still, which is Aristotle Did Not Lay the Egg, talking about the emergence of genre theory. And to some extent, I still feel that, but what you're talking about is subtler, because I think it takes into account the presence of Aristotle in whatever form it is, without sort of, not wanting to pay attention to it because it's received so much attention. And, I think we're probably in agreement about this, because I referred earlier to Weinberg's monumental history of literary criticism in the Italian Renaissance. And I've actually sort of, as much as I've been indebted to that work, I've also sort of criticized the fact that Weinberg wanted to make the poetics very much the dominant force in the emergence of theory in the Cinquecento. It's all sort of, if you read Weinberg, it's all attributable to Aristotle. He's the one. And what Corrado is talking about, which is much subtler, is Aristotle obviously has this great authority, and these writers are clever. They want to use that authority to advance ideas of their own.
And I love that you mentioned the sentence, Aristotle did not lay the egg. It's actually the first sentence of the book on architecture, and I borrow the sentence to start the book on the architecture and the poetics, because in that case, for example, for me it was important to study the impact and the influence that the rethinking of architecture and theory of architecture in late 15th century and the beginning of 16th century changed the way in which thinkers thought of the poetics, and, for example, leading to I skipped many steps that would be important, but leads to the invention, I would call it, of the unity of place, which is not there, for example. So it's important to insert the poetics in a larger context, where let's put it this way. I think many of the answer are Aristotelian, but not all the questions that the poets and the scholars had at this time. So the questions come from many other. And I just give an example related to Tasso. For example, when in the Discorsi dell'arte poetica and then the Discorsi del poeta eroico, he talks about the connection between different parts of the action. I think that it's relative. I wouldn't say clear because it's not easy, but it's possible to demonstrate that it tries to expand in a way the possibility of connections that were there in Aristotle poetics. So there is similitude and necessity. There is something more. And if you read the text, even more than that, coming to an episode that I don't know if we are going to mention it in the discussion of the reading of the Berata, but why Olinda Sophronia, for example? From the Aristotelian point of view, it doesn't make sense to have an episode with two characters that after they come in the second, they totally disappear in the mid of the second canto. So they are not necessary. It's not, but there might be some other forms of connection that, in a way, now we are able, to see and understand and theorize, I would say. And back then they were not, because they have the question, but the answer had to be Aristotelian. So this is, I think this is a way. I'm not sure that we have said everything that could be said, but this is the direction to
where you're going.
Yeah.
Can I ask you before I turn to David? We turn to David. As you can imagine, this is again, I'm showing my own biases, but one of the aspects of the book, and it's certainly not necessarily central, but you do talk about the presence of the Furioso and these oppositions in terms of generating ideas about epic. But what I realized, sort of thinking about your book in the light of this, is as you know, I've written a little bit about the presence of the Furioso in the genesis of theory in the Cinquecento. But the more I think about it, the more I think it's in some ways that kind of hostile argument towards Ariosto to sort of be able to assert your own views. It's also a little simplistic, because it really consists, I now realize it sort of consists of do's and don'ts. That reminds you of Horace, do's and don'ts. There isn't really in the Minturno, especially comes to mind, because he's one who you can really see how he discredits the Orlando Furioso in order to bring out what should be done. Ariosto is the counter model, but I think that your approach and your discussion is much more than do's and don'ts. It's much more than the Horatian tradition, because you're really getting into theoretical issues, which is what one has to look for. And I will confess, I really didn't look well enough. I remember writing an essay, I won't tell you how long ago, maybe 25 years ago. And I know that you refer to it's called, the title of it is Epic Theory in a volume that has to do with Renaissance criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I look back on this, I'm almost embarrassed because it's so kind of schematic, and it's also sort of, here's what they thought epic should be. And it's all done in terms of almost sort of, in this prescriptive way. And it, overlooks, there's nothing in my piece of many years ago that really delves into something like unity. So you can see how I'm impressed by your innovation.
Thank you. David,
enough?
Respond.
Feel free.
Time.
No, I mean, I think, if you want to add something on this particular final point.
Yeah, just when you say the do's and don'ts and the like going from prescription in a way to the theory, I think here is where the history of the theory of epic as a sort of implicit had some implicit consequences on the theory. So, for example, when Turno says what should be done by good poets, and is not the only one, but by good poets, I'm not sure that he talks about something that poets have done or would be able to do. In a way, now we live in a time in which epic is impossible. You find the idea that epic is impossible and has become impossible very long ago. It was already impossible, very difficult for talking about Voltaire or going to the Italian literature, Manzoni and Leopardi that borrows the idea from Voltaire. So there is, at a certain point in the history of the theory of epic, it comes out this idea of the epic as something that is impossible. I think it's impossible because of these do's and because of these do's that were put there in the context of debates in which they were, for example, the aim was to criticize Ariosto, but the outcome is to make, I'm oversimplifying probably, but just to give an idea, in order to criticize a poem, they came up with a concept of epic that is nearly impossible to satisfy in a way.
Well, I'm just going to finish here, but you bring that out also in Tasso.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting because you leave us, in fact, at the end of your book with this sense that it's almost impossible to carry off what he has to carry off, at least what he talks about in the Discorsi, right?
Yeah. In fact, the title of the book, Desiderio di unità, was in a way an attempt to express the idea that more than unity, it's the aim to reach. Yeah, but there's something that is, even in, we were talking about it earlier, even in the Conquistata. So it's really impossible because of, I think, the epic component of the text and not the romance. I think problems in the Liberata comes, thinking now maybe we can transition to the reading of the Liberata come from epic, from the epic tradition. Yes, yeah. Giro il computer.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what I want to pick up on that this will probably continue some of the things that we've already said. This is a very elegant and satisfying book. And it takes a single issue. How and in what ways does epic poetry and Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata in particular create a unified whole, whether formal or ideological? And we are, after all of us are, to a certain extent, heirs of Romantic criticism and its ideas of organic whole, which already are, well, they're there in Aristotle's idea of a poem as a human body, and which is a important, very important metaphor for Tasso. So we're accustomed to the idea that a work of art should be a unified whole. The question that particularly exercised people in the 16th century was the question about unity of action. And I think the shortest answer to the question that he raises is that unity is more of an aspiration than a fully realized achievement of the epic poem. And he cites a remarkable passage. We're going to go back into 16th century criticism. In Francesco Patrizzi's Parere in difesa di Ariosto from 1585, so it's right in the middle of the Ariosto Tasso debates, in which Patrizzi argues that the Iliad is a poem of multiple actions and therefore is imperfectissimo. It's the most imperfect thing you could find, if one abides by Aristotle's rule of the unity of plot. Agamemnon, all of the Greeks seek the destruction of Troy. That's okay. But Agamemnon and Menelaus want this from vengeance for Helen. The other Greek kings who joined the expeditions are out for loot and booty. They're there to Arikirsi, as he puts it. And Achilles only rejoins the battle to avenge Patroclus. So we have three different motives. And these actions and their different motivations may, in fact, finally lead to the fall of Troy, but Patrizzi does not allow for single different actions and, he doesn't allow for different actions and intentions to result in a collective goal. He just doesn't see that, and doesn't see it in the Iliad. Now, Confalonieri invokes Hegel, not the Hegel of the aesthetics, taken up by Lukács and Bakhtin, but of the philosophy of right, in order to conceive of great human actors whose individual motives are often faulty and misguided. He's thinking of Alexander the Great and particularly of Napoleon, but who nonetheless leads them to fulfill world historical destinies. Once such heroes, as Hegel says we must call them, do their deeds and change the world that they live in, change world history, they're expendable. You can send Napoleon off to St. Helena, and Alexander conveniently dies young. One can think now of Achilles in the Iliad, whose anger at Agamemnon and withdrawal from battle breaks the now 9 or 10 year stalemate at Troy. And now Hector ventures out beyond the city gates, where we are told he would never go while Achilles was on the field. And so when Achilles returns and kills Hector to avenge Patroclus, he seals Troy's doom. So the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles costs the Greeks many lives. We're told this in the opening lines of the poem. But had they not quarreled, they might not have won the war. For this is the Iliad's version of how Troy fell. And Tasso does something similar in the Jerusalem Liberata with Rinaldo. This is Tasso's version of how the Crusaders took Jerusalem, because Rinaldo is a purely fictional character who has been put into the world's historical event of the Crusades. So this leads to the question of how the difference between a character who may have his own intentions and goals and a final outcome which is of world historical importance. Tasso, this is partly for those of you who are not Tassisti, and I'm sure there are some in our audience. Tasso invents his character Rinaldo, who is also conveniently an ancestor of the Este family, who are his patrons. And he does so, and Rinaldo leaves the Crusader camp, imitating Achilles in anger, but here he is distinctly in the wrong. He goes off and has a romance with Armida, the beautiful Syrian enchantress who is out to try to stop the Crusaders from taking Jerusalem. They end up in the Canary Islands, good place to be, vacation, at least before the volcano. But then 2 Crusaders are sent out to bring Rinaldo back to Jerusalem, where he will become very important for the taking of the city. He leaves Armida, who has a great scene, which is the end of most operas based on the Jerusalem Delivered, where she, like Dido, has expresses all of her passions. And then after the battle at Jerusalem, when the war is over, Rinaldo and Armida get back together again. And I'm not sure how much of this I'm going to repeat and what I'm going to be saying, but they get back together again. And this was the passage which Tasso was told by his Roman censors. Tasso, first of all, now back up. In 1575 and 1576, Tasso composed his poetic letters. They're letters which tell us about the construction of the poem, and he's also sending off the poem to have people look at it and criticize it. And of course, like all authors, all he really wants is praise, but what he gets back is criticism, and he gets worried. He gets worried about the Roman censors, about it not being religiously orthodox enough. And so he is thinking that he will cut various passages. And again, we're talking about the unity of the poem. But does this fit? It doesn't fit into the unity of the poem. So, and that's one. And he's worried about this. And there's also the episode which was just cited of Sophronia and Olindo, where people can't figure out how it fits into the rest of the poem. Any modern reader can, but some of these readers were pretty obtuse looking at it and could not figure out how it fit into the rest of the poem. And so he was going to cut that. Around sort of later in the year 1576, Tasso has a very bad nervous breakdown. And it's the first, he will have another even more serious one for years. We can only be thankful. I mean, Tasso, we have to feel very sorry for Tasso, but we can only be thankful because this way he did not destroy the poem, which he was about to do, and which some modern editors who have found, that his last manuscript seems to have cut this episode of the reconciliation of Rinaldo and Armida, are prepared to put into an appendix after the poem has been around. I mean, I should just say, Tasso is in the insane asylum when his poem is first published in 1581, and then is published again in 1583 or 1584. And it's the second, it's the Ozana edition, which reigned forever until the 20th century when the early editions were taken more into account in our modern editions of the poem. Okay. I want to say one of the great pleasures of reading this book was what Corrado does with the reconciliation of Rinaldo and Armida, as the two lovers actually surprise each other when he leaps over her and she melts in his arms. For these are precisely the tears that Armida did not see when Rinaldo left her on her island of the Canaries. She had fainted away before the hero gave vent to his feelings. Bad timing. Similarly, Rinaldo knows that Armida has offered herself to the pagan champion who will bring her Rinaldo's head. He's heard this from the spy Vafrino. And on the battlefield in Book 20, Armida herself loses an arrow against him. And Corrado points out that Rinaldo cannot know how divided her feelings are. We do, because the narrator tells us she both wants the arrow to hit him and doesn't want the arrow to hit him. And when it bounces off his armor, and he rides on, Armida herself draws the wrong allegorical conclusion. Excuse me, where's my second? And that he's impervious to the arrows of love, and she retreats to the safety from battle, accompanied by one of her three major champions, the Persian Altamoro. In doing so, she turns the course of battle for Jerusalem in favor of the Christians. And so, in fact, both of these fictional characters, Armida and Rinaldo, are the ones who actually really determine the final battle of the war. Of course, they have no historical existence. Rinaldo has seemed to get his priorities straight, and I think this is one place where we can ask you a question, Corrado. He kills the Turk Solimano, his divinely destined foe, a Turnus for his Aeneas, and in doing so, he wins the battle almost single-handedly. But Corrado shows us it's not quite so simple. On either side of Solimano, Rinaldo kills the two other major champions of Armida. First, the Indian Adrasto, and then by now it seemed like overkill, the Egyptian Tisiferno. Is he fighting for the larger Christian cause or in personal battles with these multi-ethnic rivals for the hand of Armida? Now, the question has practical consequences for the reader of the poem's ending or sets of endings, and it has theoretical implications. Rinaldo may put first things first and put Armida on hold, but he has not, it turns out, given up his love for her, even after his moment of conversion in Canto 18 under the spiritual guidance of Peter the Hermit, where it sure looks as if he has decided that he's no longer interested in love. Rinaldo finds Armida about to commit suicide, guiding another of her arrows at her own breast. What happens next is a scene where both characters discover that the other is still in love with them. And that, I think, is really one of the things to really take away from this book, is that in this final reconciliation has been so carefully constructed by Tasso that neither of them knows what the other is actually feels for them. And we watch them discover this. He promises to be her champion and to set her back on her Syrian throne. She presents herself as his handmaid, echoing the Virgin Mary at the Annunciation. Echo lancilla tua, not lancella tua, lancilla tua, just so we make sure that we are hearing the Bible, she says, and hints at her future conversion to Christianity. Confalonieri persuasively argues that this reuniting of the lovers does not have to be read, or at least does not have to be exclusively read, as a return of romance into the Liberata at its end. The epic hero, he contends, can have mixed motives and need not seek, as Captain Goffredo does, to a single goal. And just as Achilles seeks revenge for Patroclus and in the process brings about the fall of Troy. Moreover, Tasso has built Armida's final words deeply into the symbolic structure of the Liberata. And here, one of the questions about unity is there are other kinds of forms of unity besides unity of action, unity of symbolism, unity and semantic unity. The poem begins with the descent of the angel Gabriel in a vision that informs Goffredo that he has been chosen to be captain of the Crusaders, and thus the hero of the poem. Shades of the Annunciation. It ends with the words of Mary to the same angel. So the poem has been constructed very carefully that it will begin with Gabriel's descent and end with Armida's words of whatever they are. Conversion, submission, it's not clear. But that is a problem, for the poem does not quite end here, but returns to Goffredo, who mops up the remaining pagan army and hangs up his arms in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And in fact, Armida's words do not exactly tell us what her relationship with Rinaldo is to be. Confalonieri's reading is convinced, but we may not want to dispense quite yet with the dichotomy between epic and romance. For the epic goal and the final goal of all human lives is reached at the tomb, and the historical Goffredo of Boulogne died within a year of the ending of taking of Jerusalem. Rinaldo and Armida have some living to do, quite apart from the world historical event of the First Crusade. Tasso left their situation open-ended and open to critics like Leonardo Salviati, who wanted to know what was next, and as Confalonieri notes in a delicious passage, suspected the worst. He says, those sighs and tears, he says, would little by little develop into something more. Salviati's lubricious imaginings are a low blow against Tasso, but they're a welcome corrective to some readers who insist that Rinaldo and Armida are going to get married and live happily ever after. It's all very proper and romance in any sense of the word. Let me just say there's one other problem. Rinaldo says, I'm going to go and put you back on your Syrian throne. I'm going to be your champion. The problem is that she first came to the Crusader camp and told them a lying story about being a damsel in distress who's been displaced from her Syrian throne. There isn't any Syrian throne for her to be placed on. There's going to be some explaining that these lovers still have to do to one another at the end of the poem. The open-endedness of this hanging plot thread is characteristic of romance. And it offers an escape hatch from the closure of significance in the world historical event that is epic's subject. Life and history go on, and often in unsuspected ways. And I think that Tasso's anxiety about the reconciliation of his lovers, and here's my question to you, Corrado, has more to do with the freedom, both artistic and ideological, that romance and its unfinished business could represent. And I mean, Corrado is writing in dialogue with what is perhaps the most important critical discussion of this poem, Sergio Zatti's L'uniforme cristiano e multiforme pagano, which does take the epic and romance opposition in the poem and plays it out ideologically as a kind of resistance to counter-reform authority. And I just to repeat what I've already said several times, that Rinaldo and Armida are fictions. So among other things, when they have done their duty and ensured that Jerusalem is liberated, they can go off into a fictional world of their own. They're no longer needed. Part of what is happening at the end of the poem is Tasso knowingly separating fiction from history. Okay, I should stop at this point. And I guess I do have a couple of questions here. One of which is about, if we take the Hegelian model, and see world historical events, A, one has to decide what is a world historical event, but B, Tasso's poem offers some resistance to that too, or at least the situation does. In 1187, I think I've got that right, it was 1184, Jerusalem will be recaptured by the Muslims. This is a short-term victory, which by the time that Tasso is writing in the 16th century, it's over. So one question is, how significant is this world historical event, and how is it measured? We are told that Soleimano the Turk, who is defeated and killed, but we're told that he is the ancestor of Suleiman the Magnificent. So there's some ways in which it's not even clear who has won and who has lost this war. So I guess one question that I have for you is, does one need a providential, and in the case of Hegel, it's just impossible to know whether this is secularized or still Christian, a providential view of history in order to have epic? And that's one question. My other question, I guess, has to do with what other kinds of unity are construct the unity of an epic poem. One, and I guess one way to ask this question is, what is Sofronia and Olindo doing here? Well, have you never heard of entrelacement, which is Ariosto's way of taking episodes and making them mirror one another? And Sofronia is a kind of mirror image of Armida. And there are other ways in which this works. So Tasso knows this. That's why he put it in. The question is, what other kinds of unity will construct the poem?
Thank you. Thank you. It would be hard to answer because I was trying to listen to you as carefully as I could and think of possible questions that were implicit in what you were saying, and now I have two very difficult questions to answer. So I will try to do that, and I start from the last point, the second question that you ask, and I have to say I'm thinking of both your questions now. There, to some extent, there is something that, especially in the first one, that I have not entirely considered as I was writing. So my answer in a way would be provisional. But going to the what other kinds of unity are there? One way to answer, to try to find points, possible points to start, is what a colleague and a friend, Emilio Russo, maybe other scholars too, but I read recently an essay that he wrote about Goffredo and Solimano, talking about secret connections that are in the poem between, as you said, Olindo and Sophronia, some sort of relationship with other characters. So there are secret connections in the poem that are not necessarily the connections that Aristotle speaks about in the Poetics and theorizes in the Poetics. So connections between characters, in that case, Goffredo and Solimano, or female characters, there are some sort of connection. So not the connections of different episodes of a varietà that comes together as a form of unità, as Tasso himself. I try in the book to show how Tasso himself was he expressed his ideas and conveyed his ideas in Aristotelian ways that does not necessarily correspond to what he does in the poem. So the short answer would be a non-Aristotelian unity, meaning that it's possible that in the poem there are some other forms of connection. For example, talking about Olindo and Sophronia, I mentioned a sentence of Paolo Fabri, who working in semiology, meaning that it talks about coerenza and coesione testuale. So coesione would be the Aristotelian way of connecting parts of the poem, and coerenza is there is some sort of coherence between parts of the poem that are not strictly connected. And you talked about entrelacement, so the Aristotelian way of connecting things, or what Tasso says in the poem, having a poem that keeps together variety and unity, a variety of an action that leads to a unity. And I think here it's important not to apply the theory that the theories that we have, even Tasso's theory, to read the poem, the Gerusalemme Liberata, and the other epic poem. We'll stop here for the moment to answer to try to find an answer also for your first question. That I don't know if the term comes to my mind, because I know that you're a friend with Sergio Zatti and Francesco Orlando, and speaking about Francesco Orlando, when you were talking about Hegel and the Welthistorischen Individuen, so the world historical heroes like Napoleon, and this is a model that interests me to think about the action of the epic. I do not in the book follow Hegel until, like, in a way, your questions is a question to the unconscious part of my argument, okay? Because I'm interested in the model of the action and finding a way to think of an action that is just one action, but with different ends. Okay, and I find it in Hegel. and there is some sort of abstraction in the way in which I use this concepts, ideas, aesthetics, philosophy of right, some of the text of Hegel. So I tried in a way to reconstruct the Hegel's theory of action, which is not easy because the aesthetics is an unfinished work. There are some just notes in the philosophy of right. It talks about action, but it's not that long. Then there is there are the lectures of the philosophy of history. So there are different texts that I try to put together and in order to find a theory of action that allows me to read the José Meliberata in another way. But I was not interested in the philosophy of history in Tasso, but I should have been. And now I'm thinking of it, it's this is the historical event at the end of 11th century at the point in which Tasso writes that many you said that very shortly after the First Crusade the Muslim reconquered. Yeah, and then at the time in which Tasso was writing, there was still from the point of view of history, this conflict was still important. So there is one of the Battle of Lepanto and in the 15th century other. So it's possible to think of that to use the same. I mean, the same materials that I work with from the point of view of theory, meaning, and I would use for my, it's a sort of observation or criticism to my own work. I take from Hegel's philosophy of history something that then I do not use in the field of a philosophy of history. It's important for me as a model to think of the epic, the unity of action, but and thinking of it for the future. So I'm sorry, in a way I don't have an answer now, but this is the way in which I would organize my thoughts on the program.
Well, thank you again to the three of you for these very interesting remarks. I mean, we do have some time for questions. I think there are so many things which we could say about this book. I mean, I will just add a little footnote here at the point that when I first read the title of the book, before reading the book, I thought, well, that's a great question, that of unity, because we have been talking and reading about the problem of unity in epic more broadly, and Tasso more specifically. But of course, before reading, I wasn't expecting that kind of fresher and more sort of novel way of really approaching the question. And I think the discussion today, among the many aspects which has been touching upon, has really showed that Corrado's book kind of really provides a new insight into what we can say and how we can conceive the very notion of unity when we talk about epic, and specifically about the case of Tasso. I really like the idea of unities which go beyond the typical Aristotelian trinity of place, action, and time. And I think there are many other unities or sort of concerns about unities which certainly inhabit the Gerusalemme Liberata. And the book, sort of, even if you don't have an answer for David's question, I think does touch really upon many of these problems, and of course the problem of what to do with Aristotle in this framework is extremely dear to my heart. So I'm very happy that we have been dealing with that as well. Let's open it to questions from the audience, either here in the real world or from exactly. Jane.
Yeah, no, thanks for the trivia. It was really a great discussion and on a really fascinating book, which I've read much too quickly and will now go back to based on this conversation. As you know, I've been obsessed with issues of linguistic unity in Tasso over the years, and I'm just curious. I know, one of David's questions to you was what are the other kinds of unity we could be thinking about, and so I guess I'd like to throw that on the table. Obviously, this is not your focus in any way in the book, but given that this also obviously emerges from Aristotle in terms of the kinds of language one can use, and given that someone like Javitch, who you cite, is very critical of Tasso's refusal to stick with Tuscan, which is, of course, one good way to create a unified epic poem for the Brisca in the 1580s. I'm just curious what relevance, if any, you see this particular issue possibly having.
Yeah. It's first of all, it's true that I do not in the book. I was as we were discussing the book, we mentioned the Discorsi d'arte poetica, three of them, and then the Discorsi d'arte, the poema heroic are longer in 6 books, but language comes in the third of the Discorsi d'arte poetica, which is the book dedicated to style, but I do not consider in this book, if not for some just quick references here and there. I think this is another point which I'm not sure I have an answer, but I have there is a very good paper that came out I think 3 or 4 years ago by Francesco Ferretti, dedicated to the style and to the epic. Francesco Ferretti mentions the idea of the epica inclusiva. So Francesco himself tried to reconsider Bakhtin, and so the idea that epic is the genere inclusivo and not the romanzo, because in the opposition by Bakhtin, it's clear that the hero is the romanzo, so the best is the romanzo because of the possibility that the romanzo, the novel, in that case, I use the Italian term here to be more comprehensive, includes other genres. And I think I refer to that article because I find it in line with what I tried to say about other issues in the poetics, and talking about Tasso, Discorsi d'arte poetica, the first and the second book, because from the point of view of the third book, it comes up with this idea of the epica inclusiva and the style of epic, the theory of the style that Tasso, in a way, learned in Padova so in Veneto, he was very young, allows him to have an idea about styles that there's stile magnifico and stile, but it's a meaning of stile magnifico that does not exclude from the text other style, linguistics, but it's uno, so unitario. There is unity in style, even if unitario as it is inclusivo in a way. So this is the I think it's not my idea, but when I read and we talked about the book with Francesco as I was finishing it, when I read that paper, I think that the idea of epica inclusiva from the point of view of style is compatible, so it is in line with what
No, thanks. And just a really quick, just a little footnote. As you were saying this, I was just wondering to what extent that Kruska's, almost condemnation of Tasso's lexicon and style is in some way a manifestation of their desire to see an epic a kind of national genre, right? They really wanted Tasso's poem, ideally, to manifest this kind of, this whatever the new nation of Italy might look like, sometime in the future. Certainly, at least they want a kind of cultural epic, let's say. So again, I'm just curious to what extent. You don't have to answer this now because other people certainly have questions, but it just creates this interesting opposition, thinking of kind of national/cultural unity as it should be manifested in the poem by way of its language versus other kinds of
Yeah, just a national cultural unity is very interesting to me, at least, because at that moment, national is problematic for Italy. Exactly. And so this is the cultural unity is the only unity that is achievable in a way. Any questions?
Yes, sure. Of course.
Are there any questions from?
No, that's a different thing. That's the caption, so you can just ignore.
Okay.
Of course, if the participants on Zoom wish to ask questions, you can raise your hand while we see. Any other questions from the room?
Yeah, Corrado, could you say a bit more about the function of Homer in this discussion? Because in many ways you have a dynamic approach to the whole question of epics. So is Homer fixed or dynamic as a topic or as a subject for discussion in the 16th century?
Okay. Thank you so much for the question, and I'm very happy to try to answer it. And I'm very happy that you are asking it as your studies of the Aeneid in particular, and the relationship between the Iliad and the Aeneid was La Caccia del Modello was one of the most important for me to think about, to think, just to use your word in a dynamic way to the epics. So my idea, and I try to show it by reading 16th century theorists and the way in which they try to make sense of both the Aeneid and the Iliad. So I would expand the question beyond Homer in a way, so the Achilles in the Cinquecento was a problematic character, especially for Tasso. I think for the entire career of Tasso till the very end in the Judicio, there is a sentence that I mentioned very early in the book because it compares the Iliad to the body, the human body, and so the metaphor of the capo e della mano, Goffredo and Rinaldo applies to Agamemnon and Achilles too. And according to Tasso, Achille è un braccio smisurato nel corpo dell'Iliade. So it is too big for the body of it is a part of the body, but too big, a part too big for that body, which is part of. And I think that here is the problem that Tasso has to deal with, because it's clear, as Carlo Buscaglio and other scholars said, it's clear that the structure of the Gerusalemme Liberata comes from the Iliad more than from other poems. So the model of the Eroe Assente, you talked about the fact that Rinaldo leaves, and many of the things he does in the poem refer to what Achille does, and I think one of the problems he is addressing both in his theory and in the Gerusalemme Liberata is to adapt the model of Homer, which for him was problematic, dynamics, going back to Homer for him was a possible source of ambiguity, and he has to deal with that. In the Judicio, in the text, in a way, he tries in the Gerusalemme Liberata to reverse the rapporti di forza, the relationship between Agamemnon and Achilles, and he says that. And he says, mio Goffredo is different from Agamemnon because Agamemnon è un capo scemo ed imperfetto, e il mio Goffredo invece quello come dovrebbe essere. And so it's not a good capo, and Achille in the Iliad is not as the hero should be, and Rinaldo or Riccardo in the Gerusalemme Liberata, according to what Tasso said, is. I think that that is not the case, because going back to the Iliad brings in the poem that Tasso is writing. And here I point at the Conquistata more in the Liberata some other ambiguities that he had not considered, meaning the fact that the heroes, the actions of the heroes are motivated by ends that contrast with the ideology of the poem, of what the ideology of the poem should be, according to what Tasso says from the very first stanza.
Yeah, I don't remember which Tassista, it could be you, has pointed out that the famous passage in Tasso where the Christian camp must speak together into one body, one voice, just one, is actually based on a passage in Statius' Achilleid, where Statius, in a way which is completely unhistorical and also unhomeric, states that the goal of the Trojan War is the creation of one body, one unified Greek empire. So it's curious that some of those ideas are already found in antiquity.
Yeah.
Also, they look like a manipulation.
Yeah, and it might be you. I don't think it was the one, but
you have done so many things.
Fantastic. But it's true that I was talking about the way in which these poems, Homer was read in the through Virgil, because it was here in the 16th century. In many cases, the model of the hero that came from Homer was more problematic than the model of Virgil, according to 16th century theories. So there are some sort of mediation, and I discussed some of the readings that theorists of the 16th century offered of for example, the final duel between Aeneas and Turnus in the Aeneid, or readings of the Iliad. For example, there was a huge discussion about what the Iliad is about. Does the Iliad, Homer, did he want to tell us the story of the Conquista di Troia, so the War of Troy, or just an episode of that? And there are many different interpretations that leads to different ideas of what a good epic should be. Yeah, and what is and I think this, going back in a way to something that you said when you talked about the 16th century theorists as thinkers, I think that many of these ideas that were it came out in the context of polemica, dispute, readings, were not organized in coherent theories, but are very, I would use the word smart, that we can use them to see what was felt as problematic, difficult, ambiguous, and now maybe we are able, because we are not forced to apply an Aristotelian, for example, sets of ideas. So, yeah.
Luca, and then.
Thank you all for this presentation, and thank you, Corrado, for writing this book. So while I was listening to the discussion, I was thinking how crucial the problem of unity became in the rewriting of the Gerusalemme Liberata by Tasso in the Gerusalemme Conquistata, and I was thinking of the episode of Rinaldo e Armida. So the kingdom is not on the Canary Island anymore, is in the Mount Lebanon, and there is not the reconciliation between the two characters because Armida is actually killed by Carlo Ubaldo. So I was just wondering if you can tell us what is your and which are not Carlo Ubaldo, or their names are different. So what are your thoughts about, what is your interpretation about that? So do you think that in Gerusalemme Conquistata the unity is definitely achieved, and if this desire for unity is fulfilled, if it is a failure, because no one reads the very few people reads the Conquistata anymore, and everyone reads the Liberata. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, because it gives me the opportunity to go back to some of the things that I was trying to say, but I'm sure that I did it in an effective way. So no, I don't think that the unity was achieved in the Conquistata. Actually, I think that in a way, the last chapter of the book, the last part of the chapter dedicated to Tasso, the Capo e la Mano, and to the I talk about Goffredo and Rinaldo, but Riccardo comes in at the end. It's important for me, on the one hand, as David Quint said, in a way to read the final reconciliation of Rinaldo Armida within the subplot, we could say, of that connects the 16th canto to the 20th canto on the one hand, and on the other hand, to use the revision of the poem, there's Rosaria Conquistata, is something that makes even more explicit the attention that is there because of the genre. So when we don't have the reconciliation of Rinaldo Armida, we expect that the fine collettivo, so the war where Rinaldo, now Riccardo, fights for the collective war. We would expect that the collective end emerges. That's not the case, because it goes back to the Iliad, and what we need in the Conquistata for Riccardo to come back is the fact that it is the vendetta, so the revenge. He wants to he wants to fight. He wants to participate in the war because of because of their revenge. Okay, so this is I use the Jerusalem Conquistata to show how the fact of going back to the Iliad does not lead necessarily to unity, but to not to. At the beginning of the project, I was trying to express this in this term. So the opposition is not only between unity and variety, but unity, non-unity, and variety. The Conquistata is unity and non-unity. So it's not variety of Ariosto's variety, but unity and non-unity, much like the finale of the Aeneid.
Thank you very much. I'm much more familiar with the Spanish social discourse that inherited some of these Italian debates. And I was just reading, for instance, a book that discusses in quite some depth the way in which the Romance in Spain, especially people like Cascales or El Pinciano, started to criticize the Romance as being something mad. The word uses disparate, which actually gets translated as something, as an action, actually, that does not have a real end, or that is not done in the proper way. That's Covarrubias' definition of disparate. So then I was wondering, in your definition of, let's say, the heroic poem or the epic as one which is so concerned with unity, how do we make sense of that whole tradition of criticism of the Romance, especially in Spain, that seems to emphasize the structural disharmony or interior madness in which an action cannot actually be, or in which the end of the action is never fulfilled? If you have any thoughts on that whole counter-reformation, let's call it, critique of the Romance. First
of all, the book that you mentioned,
Porzione, it's the book on Persiles, Aristotle, and Cervantes.
Okay. Yeah, I read it.
Everyone should read it.
Yeah, I read it for. I work in for. It's a sort of side project of this project on the Tasso's Eleutheros, and I read it. It came out in 1970.
Yeah.
1970. Because yes, this is. I'm not sure I have an answer, but the way in which many of these the ideas that we have discussed, it's true that Italian as you said, and I agree, like theorists, like thinkers, really thinkers, and in a way, in my book, reading Giraldi, Pigna, and Minturno and Society together with Hegel, Lukács, Bakhtin, with a way of implicitly saying that, I mean, they are not Hegel, but okay, but there is we can have a conversation in a way between these moments, and some of these ideas, 16th century ideas, are it's possible to look at them from the point of view of France, Spain, and the reception of Heliodorus, for example, is one of the I was in that case very much interested in the way in which Heliodoro was used in between epic and romanzo, and the romanzo that were both, I would say, not only the romanzo still in need of a definition, and Heliodorus came in, and I studied the case of Tasso, for example. It gave him the opportunity to have an ancient model that was so ancient and not modern, that shares some characteristics with Ariosto. So the discussion, for example, is the Ethiopica an epic or a romance? It's a difficult discussion because some of these poets said, oh no, it's an epic, because considering it as an epic allowed them to bring in some features of the romance, or of the romance, but calling them epic, so legitimate. So this is just, and I think that in Spain, I wrote the paper some years ago, so now I don't remember, but I tried to address the topic from the point of view of a larger European, use this word, context. So the reception of a text that is not really, that doesn't really fit in the categories of genre. But and so I try to look at the other way. So it's a genre that is used to create new concepts of genre, both in Italy and Spain.
Right. Well, I see that we have congratulations for Corrado and for the discussion from our friends on Zoom. I think we are sort of approaching our end here. Of course, we can sort of continue the conversation, but I guess we might want to wrap things up. I'm just wondering whether the title of the book might be at this point reimagined as, instead of Il desiderio di unità, as La paura della varietà, right? Which seems to be the other side of the problem here. I really enjoyed your point about unità, non-unità, and varietà as the three terms of a conundrum, rather than the kind of regular traditional sort of dichotomy between unity and lack of unity, which brings us back to the previous installments of discussions about unity in Tasso. So please join me in thanking Corrado, Professor David Quint, Professor Javitch for this great conversation, and have a great weekend, everybody.